Hi, my name is Lucas Hendrick, if you haven't met me before. Today I'm going to talk about Toward a Theory of Property Rights by Harold Demsetz. And what I'll try and do is break this down into the real important ideas and main takeaways that at least what I understood. Obviously I'm looking forward to any comments where I get things wrong or leave out anything important. So Harold Demsetz made very important contributions in the economics of property rights, obviously, as well as industrial organization. And one thing that's notable in this paper and in a lot of his work is that there really isn't any math involved here. Where instead of a proof or an algorithm or a model, what we have is more of an anthropological study to demonstrate, in this case, the emergence of property rights. So why property rights? Why is this important? So Harold Demsetz, in what I've read about him and in his work, often takes a concept that maybe we take for granted and explains its emergence and always with the backdrop of the market as being kind of the motor for the emergence of different phenomena. So in this case, why do property rights exist? Because every marketplace transaction consists of the exchange of two bundles of property rights. That's what goods are. So similar to Coase, who was an influence in really emphasizing the importance of clearly defined property rights. Well, what we're doing here in this paper is exploring how did they come about. So important ideas. So while we know the subject here is property, what we're really talking about is the market, and a recurring theme will be transaction cost. So obviously, a market with zero transaction costs is the ideal, and a market is efficient when those transaction costs are as low as possible. One thing that adds to transaction costs, well, externalities add to transaction costs. And if property rights can internalize externalities, transaction costs are reduced. So therefore, property rights arise from the market as an efficient way to reduce transaction costs when the gains from defending the rights are higher than the cost for enforcing them. And that's another very important point because we'll see that property rights really respond to questions of scale and size. So the paper is broken into three parts, essentially, including an introduction and a conclusion. But the three main parts are the first, to explore the concept of property rights, the role of property rights. The second, how they emerge. And again, instead of demonstrating this with math and data, this is demonstrated with anthropology, essentially, and history. Where we look at Native Americans in North America during the fur trade. And then we discuss a bit about the coalescence and ownership of property rights. What we mean there is kind of the structure of property rights. And again, how that is, how that's organized in terms of, at what level, state, communal, or individual. So Demsetz says that, this is in quotes, that externalities or an externality is an ambiguous concept. We think about it as something good or bad, usually bad, that has an impact on some kind of activity. In the examples he uses, I think he tries to get us to open up our mind about what externalities are by using a couple examples that may not seem that intuitive at first. The third example, factory pollution, is very intuitive. We kind of understand that easily, but he uses slavery in the military draft. I find the use of slavery here in this context, it works. It's a little bit problematic because I think slavery usually entails complete coercion, absolute loss of freedom. But what he's talking about here is internalizing that loss of freedom in some kind of right where there can be a negotiation or an exchange in which the cost of freedom is part of that negotiation. So in talking about internalizing the externality in this case, I'm going to use the military draft just because to me it's a bit easier to talk about, and it also kind of includes the idea of a market solution in this discussion of rights. So you can imagine a couple of different ways to internalize the externality of a military draft. And again, military draft is just sort of the bad thing we want to deal with here. One would be a law that demands payment equal to the cost of a person's exemption, in which case there is some sort of committee that's going to determine what that cost is, or a system that considers what everyone is willing to pay and everyone can negotiate that. And I think implicitly what we're saying here is that number two is better in this case because, well, it keeps the transaction costs low and also might guarantee a better result, which adds to the efficiency, the market efficiency in this case. Why is that? Because it probably wouldn't be too hard to implement some kind of scale or a way that someone could say, look, I really don't mind defending my country, so I'm going to pay very little or zero, or I really don't want to serve my country in this way, so I can buy out essentially or buy myself out of the draft. And so the people that wind up participating actually want to be there a bit more than people that are there essentially against their will. So if that were determined by a law and not, let's say on the basis of individual negotiation, so much as just, this is the cost, then that might not be sized right. So again, we're also thinking about scale because this is an example where it might not be that difficult for individuals to just, answer with essentially what they're willing to pay. That may not be the case with pollution, because with pollution, you have a factory and you have many people living in a neighborhood or in a city. That negotiation might not be efficient on an individual level, on a case-by-case basis. So again, we're seeing that internalization is going to occur, but how it occurs is really the cost benefit of that, and will play itself out in different ways depending upon the scale and the size essentially of the property, tangible or not, that we're talking about here. So that concludes the first part where we get the concept. And again, the main takeaway there is that the right seeks to internalize an externality. Now we're going to talk about how this came about, the emergence. Emergence is the word that Demsetz uses. And again, I like this because it kind of makes you think back on Adam Smith and how the market comes about as not by one individual actor or state actor, but rather self-interested individuals, and thrown into a negotiating process, if you will, of buying and selling goods, which yields the most efficient result. So here we're seeing that property rights are emerging in a particular context, and not imposed upon the actors in that context per se. It kind of emerged because of the necessity that comes out of these new externalities that were introduced. So basically the externality, again, and this isn't emphasized so much by Demsetz, but I kind of like to think about it too, is it's both new good and bad things. But basically, when things change and there are new externalities, then these rights will emerge. And examples are, easy to find with air rights and pollution, renters' rights, accident liability, particularly with the advent of the automobile. And then, although he doesn't mention this, it predates Demsetz or this paper, is the rise of the internet, which you can imagine a lot of new good and bad things, essentially, those being externalities that are introduced. So again, the context here that where we see this emergence is during the fur trade in Labrador and Quebec in North America in the 18th century. And the externalities here, while on the good side, you could say, well, this new idea of commerce, this new, let's say, economic activity that's starting to occur due to discovery of how to take these pelts and trade them with other nations. But the bad side, the bad externality in this case would be the cost of overhunting, for example. Obviously the value of fur goes up, so there's more incentive to hunt, and then incentive for individuals to raise their own animals to then hunt. Now, it's important to note that this is occurring with forest animals that tend to stay in relatively the same spot. So establishing property rights here makes sense due to the scale that we're going to discuss in a minute. But basically, the discussion here, and again, important to note, is the emergence of property rights coming about by necessity, where these externalities needed to be internalized, and this is anthropological. There's no math here. It's just this example of the fur trade. So, in kind of posing the question, so that didn't occur in the Southwest. It did occur in the Northeast, and we'll see in the Northwest as well. Why is that? Where you still have people and animals and hunting occurring. The answer here is again, it's going to respond to that question of scale. So animals are great to eat, but they weren't being used for any other or many other purposes. Clearly, you could use them, but there wasn't commerce around that reuse of animals. There are large amounts of land that they're grazing on. So here we see that property rights would have had a higher cost to internalize these externalities, both good and bad, than by policing them than not having them. So again, we're seeing this response to a question of size and scale. But on the other hand, in the Northwest, not only do you have property rights, but they include family inheritance. So also including that externality of the future, of what's going to happen on that land, particularly in terms of hunting fur. But you can imagine that in other cases, just sustaining land, internalizing that externality with a right that includes keeping that concern within a family. So now that we've demonstrated how property rights emerge, how they come about, which again, this is interesting with Demsetz taking this concept and then showing how it's breaking down how this emerges, really, again, going back to a market demand. And the market, what does the market want? The market wants to reduce transaction costs as close as possible to zero to be the most efficient possible. So now we're going to talk about ownership. Now, I put these in a different order. I put this in order of state, communal, individual, just because it kind of makes sense as an inverted pyramid from the most broad type of ownership down to the most particular or granular type of ownership. And in this section, he doesn't really discuss state ownership to any great degree. He discusses more cases where communal ownership may be less efficient from the idea of transaction costs than individual ownership, with different examples. So we're seeing that property rights, again, are going to respond to scale. So the externalities that are explored here are water. For example, it's great for me if I build a dam, not so good for my neighbor who might have depended upon that flow of water onto her land. also future ownership. So if a group of people own a property, it's not as easy to internalize that externality of the future group if it is very broad and owned by many people, whereas individually, the concept of family, individual ownership, assuming that it's then inherited by family, internalizes that externality. So I may farm my land in a more sustainable way today because I'm essentially negotiating with the future generations. Then I have a concern there for my progeny. Whereas in a communal scenario, that may not occur. Everyone is kind of thinking about their individual use at that time, and that negotiation isn't really possible. And think about that way. Negotiation with the future descendants of your family, if you will. And then, going back to the idea of pollution, where, and I'm going to quote directly here, negotiating and policing costs will be compared to costs that depend on the scale of ownership, and parcels of land will tend to be owned in sizes which minimize the sum of these costs. So again, this reflects back to the example with Native Americans in the Southwest, where property rights did not emerge, or at least not until, I think we all know that people own cattle ranches, but at least not at the same time, given a similar context as the Native Americans in the Northeast and Northwest. Why? Question of scale and basically cost benefit. So there is some discussion about publicly held corporations, and as an exception, that's his uppercase exception. I found this section to be a little less important in the sense that it was more like we need to cover this idea because someone could say, well, what about the corporation? And with a corporation or a publicly held corporation, you see a kind of a mixture of components that don't make it really analogous to land use. Land is capital, whereas a company has an operation, and you could say that making decisions within that operation would be very inefficient if it included everybody who owns it, so all the shareholders in essence. So they entrust that to a managerial group. Also, the liability, if something happens with that company, are all the shareholders liable? No, there's limited liability. So bottom line here, and I'll leave it for commenters to dig into this a bit more. I don't find this as important in terms of the main takeaways as the ideas that I mentioned in the beginning, and what I'll sum up in a minute here as well. And again, in directly quoting Demsetz here, all problems of externality are closely analogous to those which arise in the land ownership example, and that applies to even how corporations are organized. But again, not a huge amount of discussion here. So again, summing up, my takeaway from this paper, and again, I encourage everybody to comment on what I might have missed. But the main ideas here: markets about exchange of property, and they seek efficiency. That's something we can kind of take for granted here. Property rights seek to internalize externalities in order to reduce that transaction cost. So again, we're not taking property rights for granted at all. We're saying that, well, how did this come about? Property rights emerge when change leads to new externalities, and we see several examples of that. And then property rights scale to the lowest transaction cost, which means the benefit of property rights is greater than the cost to enforce them. So just finally, some further discussion. It's kind of serendipitous, but this week, while reading this paper and preparing this, I also heard a podcast. I often listen to Econ Talk. I may have even posted some episodes in our Slack channel about when it's relevant to what we're covering in a particular course. In this one, really property is the main subject now, and it's with Michael Heller and James Salzman, who just published a book on property and attachments and more on the role that technology plays. Demsetz isn't discussed to any depth in this podcast, but there is a lot of discussion about coasts, and again, I think the role that technology plays as it creates new externalities, both good and bad. So thank you all. Again, I look forward to the comments, and I hope this helped illuminate a bit of what this paper was about.